In polite society, love is rarely spoken of. It is negotiated instead, through marriages arranged without tenderness, through heirs demanded without warmth, through silences that protect reputation at the cost of the heart. Men of title are taught many things: how to command, how to inherit, how to conceal. But they are never taught what to do when love arrives at the wrong door. He came before dawn, when even the village birds were still asleep. A duke, mud on his boots, nobility forgotten, stood at my door with a newborn cradled against his chest, as though the child were the only fragile thing left in his life. He did not ask if I would take the baby. He only said, "He is my son, but not my wife's." Then he placed the child into my arms, as if he were surrendering something sacred, something dangerous, something that could never return to him unchanged. I should have refused. I should have asked questions. But the baby's fingers curled instinctively around mine, and in that moment I understood. Whatever this man had done, whatever secret he was fleeing, his child had already chosen where he belonged. And so, without knowing it, I accepted a love that would alter my life, challenge a marriage built on power, and force a duke to decide what he was willing to lose. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The child weighed almost nothing. That was Eliza's first coherent thought as the dawn cold seeped through her thin nightdress and the Duke's carriage disappeared into the violet-grey morning mist. The baby lay against her chest, swaddled in linen far too fine for her cottage, embroidered with initials she couldn't make out in the half-light, the kind of fabric that whispered of women who never touched their own laundry. She stood in her doorway until the rattle of wheels faded completely. Only then did she look down. The baby's face was impossibly small, features still unformed in that way newborns have, as though they haven't quite decided what shape their life will take. His eyes were closed, dark lashes resting against cheeks flushed from the cold ride. One tiny fist had worked free of the swaddling and curled near his mouth, fingers so delicate they seemed translucent in the growing light. "He is my son, but not my wife's." The Duke's words echoed in the hollow space behind her ribs. Eliza stepped back inside and closed the door with her hip, moving carefully, as though the world had become suddenly fragile. Her cottage was barely warm, the fire had died to embers hours ago, but she went to the hearth first, kneeling awkwardly with the baby cradled in one arm while she coaxed the coals back to life with the other. The kindling caught. Small flames licked upward, casting orange light across the stone floor, across the simple wooden table, across the life she had built from quiet, unremarkable losses. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed until she tried to unwrap the swaddling, and the fine linen slipped twice through her trembling fingers. The baby stirred, made a sound, not quite a cry, more of a question. His mouth worked, searching. "I know," Eliza murmured, though she didn't know. Didn't know what he needed, didn't know how long she would have him, didn't know what she had agreed to when she'd opened her door to a duke carrying impossible secrets in his arms. "I know, little one." She had goat's milk, not much, but enough. She'd been saving it for tomorrow's cheese, but tomorrow could wait. Everything could wait. She warmed it slowly over the fire, testing drops against her wrist the way her own mother had taught her years ago, back when Eliza had believed her life would hold children of her own. The baby watched her now with eyes that had opened to dark, unfocused slits. Not crying. Just waiting. Trusting in that terrible way infants do, as though the world has given them no reason yet to doubt it. Eliza dipped a clean cloth into the warm milk and touched it to his lips. He latched immediately, desperately, small throat working as he pulled at the makeshift feeding. Milk dribbled down his chin. Eliza wiped it gently, then offered more and more, until finally his suckling slowed and his eyes began to drift closed again. The fire crackled. Outside, the village was waking. She could hear the distant crow of a rooster, the creak of a neighbor's gate. Soon there would be questions. Soon there would be eyes watching her door, mouths shaping words she couldn't control. But for now, there was only this, a woman who had known loss sitting in firelight with a child who was not hers, feeding him with hands that had learned long ago how to be gentle with broken things. She looked down at the baby's face, peaceful now, milk-drunk and warm. "What has he done to you?" she whispered. Not to the child, to the absent Duke, to the man whose desperation had been evident in every rigid line of his body, in the way he'd held his son as though memorizing the weight of him. What has he done to us both? The baby sighed against her chest. His tiny hand found the fabric of her nightdress and grasped it with surprising strength. And Eliza understood, with a clarity that felt like grief and wonder tangled together, that she had just been trusted with something irreversible. Something that would mark her life with a before and after as cleanly as a knife through silk. She rose slowly, careful not to wake him, and carried him to her bed, the only bed, narrow and plain, covered with a quilt she'd pieced together from scraps over the course of a long winter. She laid him in the center, building a fortress of pillows around him so he wouldn't roll. He didn't stir. His breathing was soft, steady, the rhythm of it almost hypnotic. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed and watched him as the sun finally crested the horizon, spilling gold through her single window. The light caught the embroidery on his swaddling, and now she could make out the initials clearly. A.H. Alistair Hawthorne. She'd heard the name, of course. Everyone had. The Duke who'd married the coldest woman in 3 counties, whose estate stood like a monument to old money and older bloodlines on the hill above the village. She'd seen him perhaps twice in her life, always at a distance, always austere and untouchable. But this morning he had stood at her door with mud on his boots and rain in his hair, looking like a man who had run out of choices. Why me? The question sat in her chest like a stone. But she knew she would never ask it aloud. Some things, once spoken, could not be taken back. And some truths were too dangerous to invite into the light. So instead, Eliza Moore did what she had always done. She accepted what had been given to her, she asked no questions that might shatter the fragile gift of trust, and she made tea with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The baby slept on. And outside, the village began its daily work, unaware that everything, for one quiet woman in a small cottage, had changed in the space between midnight and morning. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne took her breakfast in the morning room, as she always did, at precisely 8 o'clock. The room was elegant, tastefully so, with walls papered in cream silk damask and windows that overlooked the formal gardens. Every surface gleamed. The silver tea service caught the light just so. The porcelain was Sevres, the napkins Irish linen, the flowers arranged by a maid who'd been trained to understand that beauty required absolute symmetry. Beatrice sat with her spine perfectly straight, never touching the back of her chair, cutting her poached egg into precise, identical pieces. She did not eat immediately. She waited. At 8 minutes past 8, the door opened, and the Duke entered. "Good morning, Beatrice." His voice was even, polite. The voice of a man addressing a business associate. "Alistair." She didn't look up from her plate. "You're late." "My apologies. I was detained." "By what, precisely?" He moved to the sideboard, serving himself from the covered dishes with methodical efficiency. "Estate matters. Nothing that need concern you." Beatrice's knife paused, just for a moment, against the porcelain. Then resumed its careful cutting. "I see." The silence that followed was familiar, not uncomfortable, because discomfort required caring, and their marriage had long since moved beyond such vulnerabilities. It was simply empty. A space where conversation might have lived, in a different sort of union. Alistair took his seat across from her. The table was long enough that they could have fit 8 people between them, but Beatrice preferred it this way. Distance maintained decorum. She studied him over the rim of her teacup. He looked tired. More than tired, there was something strained about his movements, as though he were holding himself together through sheer will. His cravat was slightly askew. Not enough that anyone else might notice, but Beatrice noticed everything. "You came in very late last night," she said. "Not a question. A statement of fact." "I did." "After midnight." "Yes." She set down her teacup with precise care. The sound of porcelain meeting saucer was delicate, controlled. "The servants talk, Alistair." "Do they?" "They wonder where their master goes at such hours. What business requires a man to leave his home in darkness and return before dawn?" She picked up her knife again, resumed eating. It creates speculation. Alistair's jaw tightened. I'm not accountable to the servant's speculation. No. But you are accountable to your name. Our name. She looked at him directly now, her grey eyes cool and measuring. Appearance, Alistair, is not a trivial concern. It is the foundation upon which families like ours maintain their position. Without it, we are simply people with money. Common. The word hung in the air between them like a curse. I'm aware of the importance of appearance, Alistair said quietly. Are you? Beatrice tilted her head slightly, the movement bird-like, predatory. Because your recent behavior suggests otherwise. These excursions. This distraction. Whatever it is that pulls you from your own home at ungodly hours. It's handled. Is it? Yes. The lie sat between them, obvious as a bloodstain on white linen. But Beatrice was too well-bred to press further. Not here. Not yet. She simply filed the information away, the way she filed away all useful knowledge, carefully, categorically, to be retrieved when the moment required it. She returned her attention to her breakfast. Lord and Lady Pemberton are hosting a dinner next month. I've accepted on our behalf. Of course you have. The Wintertons will be attending. Lady Winterton asked specifically about you. How kind. She has an unmarried cousin. Quite wealthy. Quite suitable for Beatrice. Alistair's voice was sharp now, the first real emotion he'd shown. We've discussed this. We've discussed nothing. You've simply refused to engage with reality. She set down her silverware with careful precision and folded her hands in her lap. We've been married for 6 years, Alistair. 6 years. And in that time, I have performed every duty required of a wife of my station. I have managed your household flawlessly. I have maintained the social connections necessary for your advancement. I have asked for nothing but what any woman in my position might reasonably expect. An heir. The word dropped like a stone into still water. A legitimate heir, Beatrice corrected, her voice never rising, never losing its cultivated smoothness. A child who can carry on your name, your title, your estate. Is that truly such an unreasonable expectation? Alistair stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, a harsh sound in the carefully controlled space. We're not having this conversation. We never have this conversation, Alistair. That's precisely the problem. Beatrice remained seated, unruffled, though something cold flickered behind her eyes. You cannot simply will an heir into existence through avoidance. At some point, we must address the fact that our marriage has failed to produce. I said, we're not having this conversation. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with barely a sound. Alistair Hawthorne had been trained too well to slam doors, even in anger. Beatrice sat alone in the morning room, surrounded by perfect symmetry and tasteful elegance. The morning light turned everything golden, the silk walls, the silver service, the untouched food on her plate. She looked at it all with the expression of someone surveying a kingdom. Her kingdom. Built on appearances, maintained through flawless execution of social duty, protected by the invisible walls of propriety and breeding. She had given up love for this, had never even expected it, really. Love was for poets and fools. What mattered was position. Legacy. The kind of power that came from an unassailable name. But power, Beatrice had learned long ago, required vigilance. She rang the small silver bell beside her plate. A maid appeared immediately, young, nervous, impeccably uniformed. Yes, my lady. Send for Mrs. Crawford. The housekeeper, my lady. Yes. Immediately. The maid curtsied and disappeared. Beatrice returned to her breakfast, cutting the now cold egg with the same precise movements as before. Mrs. Crawford arrived within minutes, a woman of 50, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, who'd been with the Hawthorne household for 20 years. She knew where every skeleton was buried, and was paid handsomely for her discretion. My lady. Mrs. Crawford curtsied. "Sit." "My lady, I." "Sit, Mrs. Crawford. This isn't a formal interview." The housekeeper sat, though her discomfort was evident. Ladies did not ask their servants to sit. It suggested either unusual intimacy or unusual threat. Beatrice studied her for a long moment, then spoke with perfect, cold clarity. "My husband left the house last night. Late. He returned before dawn." She paused. "This is not the first time." "No, my lady." "You're aware of these excursions?" "The staff has noticed, my lady." "Yes." "And has anyone thought to follow him? To determine where these midnight errands take him?" Mrs. Crawford's expression remained carefully neutral. "That would be improper, my lady." "Improper?" Beatrice's laugh was soft, crystalline, completely devoid of humor. "How wonderfully discreet of you, Mrs. Crawford. But I'm not asking for propriety. I'm asking for information." The housekeeper shifted slightly in her chair. "I couldn't say with certainty, my lady." "But you have suspicions." A pause. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. "There have been rumors, my lady, in the village." "What kind of rumors?" "The sort that concern a gentleman's personal affairs." Mrs. Crawford chose her words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. "Nothing confirmed. Nothing that would." "A woman." It wasn't a question. Mrs. Crawford's silence was answer enough. Beatrice felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. Not heartbreak, she'd never loved Alistair enough for that. But something worse, the creeping sense that control was slipping, that the perfect facade she'd built was developing cracks only she could see. "Find out," she said quietly. "Find out where he goes, who he sees, and report back to me with complete discretion." "My lady, if I may." "You may not." Beatrice stood, and Mrs. Crawford rose immediately. "You may simply do as I've asked. Are we clear?" "Yes, my lady." "Good. You're dismissed." The housekeeper left quickly, relief evident in the speed of her departure. Beatrice returned to the window, looking out over the perfectly manicured gardens. Everything in its place. Everything controlled, calculated, maintained. She would not allow scandal to touch her name. Would not allow whatever weakness had infected her husband to threaten the position she'd spent 6 years cultivating. If Alistair had secrets, she would uncover them. If he had formed attachments that threatened their arrangement, she would sever them. And if there was a woman, some common, grasping creature who thought she could claim what belonged by right to Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, well, Beatrice's reflection in the window glass showed no emotion. Just a woman in perfect composure, surrounded by perfect things, planning the perfect destruction of anything that dared disturb her perfect world. "We'll see," she murmured to her own reflection. "We'll see what secrets you're keeping, husband." The morning sun continued to gild everything in gold. But the light, Beatrice noted with cold satisfaction, revealed every flaw. 3 weeks passed before he came back. Eliza had counted the days without meaning to, the way one might count the spaces between storms, knowing another would come but not when. She'd learned the rhythm of the baby's needs, how he cried differently for hunger than for cold, how he settled best when held against her left shoulder, how his tiny fingers would grasp at air when he dreamed. She'd named him Thomas, in her mind. Never aloud. He wasn't hers to name. It was late afternoon when the knock came, firmer than last time, almost apologetic in its restraint. The autumn sun hung low and golden through the trees, painting everything amber. Eliza had been mending a shirt, Thomas asleep in the wooden cradle she'd borrowed from her neighbor with a story about a cousin's child. She set down her needle carefully and wiped her palms against her apron, a nervous gesture she hadn't noticed herself developing. She opened the door. The Duke stood on her threshold looking somehow smaller than she remembered. Still imposing, he couldn't help that, with his height and his fine clothes and the way he held himself, but there was something diminished about him. as though the weeks had worn at him like water on stone. "Miss Moore." His voice was carefully neutral. "My lord." She didn't curtsy. Somehow it seemed wrong, here, with the baby sleeping just behind her. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. The golden light caught the dust motes between them. "I've come to." He stopped, started again. "I wanted to see, to ensure that you've had everything necessary for his care. We've managed. I brought," he gestured to a parcel tucked under his arm, wrapped in plain cloth. Nothing ornate, nothing that would draw attention. Some things. Clothing. Other necessities. Eliza took the parcel. Their fingers didn't touch, but she felt the deliberate space he'd left, the careful choreography of distance. "Thank you." Another silence. The Duke's eyes moved past her, searching the dim interior of the cottage. "May I?" He cleared his throat. "May I see him?" Eliza hesitated. Not because she wanted to refuse, but because something in his voice, raw and carefully hidden, made her chest ache with recognition. This was not a man checking on property. This was a father who had counted days just as she had. She stepped back, opening the door wider. He entered as though the cottage were made of glass, each movement measured, careful not to disturb anything. His eyes found the cradle immediately. Thomas slept on his back, one small fist thrown above his head, his rosebud mouth working occasionally at dreams of milk. He'd grown in 3 weeks, not much, but noticeably. His face had lost some of that undefined newborn quality. He was becoming himself. The Duke stopped beside the cradle. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking down at his son with an expression Eliza couldn't quite name. It wasn't joy, too painful for that. Wasn't grief, too tender. It was something caught between wanting and restraint, between love and impossible distance. His well. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Very well. He eats like he's afraid the milk will disappear." Eliza moved to stand on the opposite side of the cradle, the baby between them like a small, sleeping bridge. "He's strong. Healthy. He looks." The Duke stopped, jaw working as though the words were lodged somewhere painful. "He looks content." "He is." Something flickered across the Duke's face, relief mixed with something darker. He reached toward the baby, then stopped himself, hand hovering in the air before falling back to his side. "You can touch him," Eliza said quietly. "He won't break." "I have no right." "You're his father." The words hung in the small cottage like a confession. The Duke looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since entering. His eyes were dark, haunted by something Eliza recognized from her own mirror in the years after her losses. "Am I?" he asked, and the question held so much weight it nearly buckled. "A father who abandons his son to a stranger? Who visits like some guilty shadow?" "A father who saved his son," Eliza corrected. Her voice was firm, surprising herself. "A father who knew he couldn't give the child what he needed and found someone who could." The Duke's expression cracked, just for a moment, pain surfacing through the careful control before he mastered it again. He looked back down at Thomas. This time, when he reached out, he didn't stop himself. His hand hovered over the baby's chest, so large it could have covered the tiny torso completely. Then, with infinite care, he let one finger trace the curve of Thomas's small fist. The baby's fingers flexed instinctively, grasping at air, nearly catching the Duke's finger before sleep claimed him again. The sound that escaped the Duke was barely audible, but Eliza heard it. A breath that shook, carrying something too big for the space between his ribs. He withdrew his hand and stepped back from the cradle as though it burned. "I should go." "You don't have to." "I do." He moved toward the door, then paused, his back to her. "Miss Moore." "Eliza." Her name in his mouth was strange, intimate despite the formality of everything else. I cannot adequately express what you've done. What you're doing. You don't need to." "I do. Because I'm asking you to continue doing something that will cost you far more than I have any right to ask." He turned, meeting her eyes. "The village will talk. They already do. They'll make assumptions. Cruel ones. Let them talk. You don't understand what they'll say. What they'll—" "I understand perfectly." Eliza crossed her arms, not defensively, but as though holding something fragile inside herself. "I understand that people will whisper. That they'll invent stories to explain what they can't know. That my reputation, such as it is, will suffer." "Then why?" "Because he needs someone." She glanced back at the sleeping baby. "And because I've learned that reputation means very little when weighed against a child's life." The Duke stared at her as though seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as a convenient solution to an impossible problem, but as a woman making her own impossible choice. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm practical." "No." He shook his head slowly. "Practical would be refusing. Practical would be protecting yourself. This is—" he stopped, searching for the word. "This is grace. Undeserved and freely given." The air between them felt suddenly too warm, too close. Eliza looked away first. "He'll wake soon. He'll be hungry." "Of course." The Duke moved to the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. "May I? Would it be acceptable if I visited again?" "You don't need permission to see your own son." "Nevertheless, I'm asking." Eliza studied him, this powerful man made powerless by circumstance, asking permission to witness the life he couldn't claim. She thought of Beatrice in her grand house, of the cold marriage he'd described without words, of the choice he'd made in the dark that had brought him to her door. "Come when you need to," she said. "But come carefully." He nodded, understanding the warning beneath the invitation. "One more thing." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather purse, setting it on the table near the door. "For his expenses. For yours. I don't need." "Please." The word stopped her. "Let me do this one thing. Let me provide for him, even if I cannot." He didn't finish. "Couldn't." Eliza nodded slowly. The Duke left as quietly as he'd come, pulling the door shut with careful silence. Through the window, Eliza watched him pause at the edge of her small garden, his shoulders rising and falling with a breath that looked like it hurt. Then he was gone, swallowed by the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. Thomas stirred in his cradle, making small sounds that would soon become proper crying. Eliza went to him, lifting him against her shoulder, feeling his warmth, his weight, his absolute trust. "Your father loves you," she whispered against his soft hair. "Even if he can never tell you so." The baby rooted against her neck, seeking milk, seeking comfort. Seeking the things she could give that his father, for all his power and title, could not. And in that moment, Eliza understood something that frightened her. She was beginning to love this child not because he'd been entrusted to her, but because he was him. Small and helpless and hers in all the ways that mattered, even if none of the ways that would ever be recognized. She sat in her chair by the fire and began to feed him, and tried not to think about the Duke's expression when he touched his son. Tried not to think about the way her name had sounded in his voice. Tried not to think about what it meant that she'd counted the days until his return. Outside, the autumn sun set in shades of amber and gold, painting the world in temporary beauty before darkness came. Winter came early that year, sharp and unforgiving. By the time Thomas was 2 months old, frost painted Eliza's windows each morning in delicate, cruel patterns. She woke before dawn to feed the fire, to warm milk, to check that the blanket she'd tucked around the baby's cradle hadn't slipped during the night. The Duke came more frequently now. Not on a schedule, that would have been too obvious, too dangerous, but with enough regularity that Eliza found herself listening for his knock even when she shouldn't. He always brought something. Wood for the fire. Extra blankets. Once, a small tin of tea so fine Eliza had stared at it for a full minute, afraid to open it. He never stayed long. Never presumed. But each visit stretched a little longer than the last, as though time itself was being renegotiated between them. It was during one of these visits, on a grey December afternoon when snow had begun to fall in lazy spirals, that everything changed. Eliza was walking the floor with Thomas. He'd been fussy all morning, fighting sleep with the stubborn determination of someone twice his size. The baby's cries had subsided to whimpers, but he still squirmed in her arms, little face scrunched in infant displeasure. The knock came. Eliza's heart did that thing it had started doing, that quickening she pretended not to notice. She opened the door one-handed, Thomas still fussing against her shoulder. The Duke stood there, snow catching in his dark hair, his expression already shifting to concern. Is he unwell? Just tired? Fighting it like it's his mortal enemy? Eliza stepped aside to let him in. He's been like this since dawn. Alistair entered, brushing snow from his shoulders, his eyes immediately finding the baby. Thomas chose that moment to let out a particularly indignant wail. Perhaps I should return another time. Don't be foolish. You're already here, and it's snowing. Eliza shifted Thomas to her other shoulder, bouncing gently. Besides, he's not actually suffering. He just wants the world to know he's displeased. A ghost of a smile touched the Duke's mouth. Strong opinions already. Takes after his father. The words slipped out before Eliza could catch them, too familiar, too comfortable. She felt her cheeks warm, but the Duke didn't seem offended. If anything, that almost smile deepened slightly. May I? He held out his hands. Eliza hesitated. Not because she didn't trust him, but because some instinct told her this moment mattered in ways she couldn't yet see. Of course. She transferred Thomas carefully, watching the Duke's hands adjust, large and uncertain, holding the baby like precious cargo he wasn't quite sure how to secure. Thomas's wailing intensified briefly, and Alistair's expression flickered with something like panic. I don't think he... Give him a moment, Eliza said quietly. Let him catch your scent. The Duke looked at her, startled, then back down at his son. He held perfectly still, barely breathing, while Thomas's cries gradually subsided to hiccuping whimpers. The baby's unfocused eyes sought something, anything to anchor to. But he didn't settle. His face remained scrunched, small fists waving in agitation. He doesn't recognize me, Alistair said, and the pain in his voice was naked, unguarded. He's 2 months old. He barely recognizes anything yet. He recognizes you. It was true, and they both knew it. Thomas had learned the shape of Eliza, her voice, her smell, the particular way she held him. She was his world, his constant, the answer to every need. And his father was a stranger who visited. Alistair tried bouncing gently, the way he'd seen Eliza do. But his movements were too stiff, too careful. Thomas's whimpers escalated toward a full cry again. Here, like this. Eliza stepped closer, adjusting the Duke's arms, showing him how to support the baby's head while creating a gentle rocking motion. Her hands guided his, warm through the fabric of his shirt, impossibly intimate in its casualness. And relax. Babies can feel tension. They think something must be wrong if you're worried. I am worried, he admitted. I'm terrified I'll drop him. You won't. How do you know? Because you're holding him like he's made of glass. If anything, you could relax more. She demonstrated, one hand on his forearm, showing him the rhythm. See? Gentle but confident. Let him know he's safe. The Duke tried to follow her guidance, and slowly, so slowly Eliza almost didn't notice it happening, Thomas's cries began to quiet. The baby still squirmed, still fussed, but the desperate edge faded. Then Thomas yawned. It was a tiny thing, barely visible, his rosebud mouth opening wide before snapping shut. But it transformed his whole face from misery to something approaching peace. There, Eliza whispered, still standing close enough that her shoulder nearly touched the Duke's arm. He's finally surrendering. They stood together in the quiet cottage, snow falling outside the window, the fire crackling softly. Thomas's eyes began to drift closed, his small body going heavy in his father's arms. And that's when it happened. Just as sleep was about to claim him completely, Thomas turned his face toward Eliza. His tiny hand reached out, grasping at the air between them, searching. "Mama." The sound wasn't a word, not really. Just a soft noise, formless and instinctive. But it shattered something in the room's stillness. Eliza's breath caught. She hadn't taught him that. Hadn't encouraged it. But babies made sounds, tested their voices, and this one had emerged shaped by accident or fate or some cruel kindness into the one syllable that changed everything. Thomas made the sound again, more insistently, his hand still reaching toward Eliza even as he lay in his father's arms. The Duke's face had gone carefully blank, that expression Eliza had learned meant he was feeling too much to show safely. His arms tightened almost imperceptibly around Thomas. "He wants you," he said, voice rough. "He's just tired, he doesn't. He wants his mother." The word hung between them, heavy with all its impossible meanings. Eliza took Thomas gently, and the baby immediately settled against her shoulder with a small, satisfied sound. Within seconds, he was asleep, his breath warm against her neck, his complete trust a physical weight in her arms. The Duke stepped back, and Eliza saw it clearly now, the wound that had been opened. Not by cruelty or intent, but by the simple truth of a child who knew where he belonged. "Alistair," she used his name without thinking, and his eyes snapped to hers. "He doesn't understand. He's too young to. He understands everything that matters." The Duke moved to the window, looking out at the falling snow. His reflection in the glass was ghostly, insubstantial. "He knows who feeds him, who comforts him, who's there when he wakes frightened in the night." A pause. "He knows his mother. I'm not. Aren't you?" He turned to face her. "In every way that means anything to him, aren't you exactly that?" Eliza held the sleeping baby closer, feeling the terrible truth of it settle in her bones. "I never meant to replace. There was nothing to replace. His biological mother died giving him life, and my wife," he stopped, jaw working. "My wife would have let him die rather than acknowledge him. You didn't replace anyone, Eliza. You're simply the only mother he's ever known." The words should have brought comfort. Instead, they ached like a bruise being pressed. "I'm sorry," Eliza whispered. "Don't be." Alistair's voice had gone soft, almost tender. "Don't ever be sorry for loving him. He stopped, searching for words. "That's the only thing in this entire wretched situation that's wholly good." He moved toward the door, and Eliza felt something like panic rise in her chest. "You don't have to leave." "I do." He collected his coat, movements precise despite whatever roiled beneath the surface. "Every moment I'm here, I risk exposing you both. Risk making this harder than it already is. Alistair, please." He paused at the door, hand on the latch, not looking at her. "He's fortunate, you know. To have you. To know that kind of love without condition or caveat." His voice caught, just barely. "I envy him that. You're his father. You love him too." "I do. God help me, I do." He finally looked at her, and his eyes held something raw and devastating. But love from a distance isn't the same as being held through the night. It isn't the same as being the first face he sees each morning, or the voice that soothes him when he cries. "My love is," he stopped, shook his head. "My love doesn't matter to him. Not the way yours does." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" He smiled, and it was the saddest expression Eliza had ever seen. "He reaches for you, Eliza. Even in my arms, he reaches for you. That tells me everything I need to know about where he belongs." The door opened, letting in a gust of cold air and swirling snow. "I'll send more wood," the Duke said. "The winter will be harsh." Then he was gone, his figure disappearing into the white afternoon. Eliza stood in the doorway, Thomas sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, and felt the weight of what they were all becoming. Not what they'd intended, Not what anyone would have chosen, but inevitable nonetheless. She closed the door and carried Thomas to his cradle, laying him down with infinite care. He didn't wake, didn't stir. Just slept with the absolute security of a child who knew he was safe. And Eliza sat beside him, watching the snow fall beyond the window, feeling her own heart crack with a love she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. "Your father loves you," she whispered again, as she had so many times before. But now she added, in a voice barely audible even to herself, "And God forgive me, I think I'm beginning to understand how he feels." The snow fell harder, covering everything in white. Inside, the fire burned low, and two people who had never asked for this impossible situation tried to survive the cost of love given without hope of claim. Thomas slept on, dreaming whatever infants dream, unaware that he had just broken his father's heart by reaching for the only mother he would ever know. The whispers started at the well. They always did. Water drew women together, servants and shopkeepers' wives, washerwomen and widows, and where women gathered, information flowed as freely as the water itself. Eliza heard it for the first time on a bitter January morning, Thomas bundled against her chest in a sling she'd fashioned from an old shawl. She'd come early, hoping to avoid the usual crowd, but Mrs. Pritchard was already there, flanked by two younger women Eliza recognized from the baker's shop. The conversation stopped the moment they saw her. Not abruptly, that would have been too obvious. But the flow of words dried up like a stream meeting stone, and the silence that replaced it was thick with meaning. "Miss Moore." Mrs. Pritchard's smile was tight, practiced. "Out early. The baby wakes early." Eliza kept her voice neutral, set down her bucket. The pulley creaked as she lowered it into the well's dark throat. "Yes. The baby." Mrs. Pritchard exchanged a glance with her companions. "He must be, what, 3 months now? Nearly 4. Time passes so quickly, doesn't it? One hardly notices." Another pause, waited. "Though I suppose some notice more than others." The younger women tittered, soft and sharp as knives wrapped in silk. Eliza pulled up her bucket, water sloshing over the rim. Her hands were steady, but her heart had begun that sickening rhythm she'd been dreading for weeks. "Was there something you wanted to say, Mrs. Pritchard?" "Say? No, no. Simply making conversation." The older woman's eyes flickered to Thomas, visible in his sling, his small face peaceful in sleep. "Though I confess, we've all been curious. About the child's father." There it was. The question that wasn't quite a question, offered like a trap disguised as concern. "Have you?" Eliza lifted her bucket, balancing it against her hip. "Well, naturally. It's unusual, isn't it? A young woman, unmarried, suddenly appearing with an infant." Mrs. Pritchard's voice dripped false sympathy. "People wonder. They can't help it. Let them wonder." "Oh, but Miss Moore," one of the younger women leaned forward conspiratorially. "Surely you understand how it looks. You disappear for months, return with a baby, and then a certain gentleman begins visiting," Mrs. Pritchard finished smoothly. "Rather frequently. At unusual hours." Eliza's grip tightened on the bucket handle. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "We're not implying anything, dear. Simply stating facts. The Duke has been seen. His carriage, at least, has been seen near your cottage. Multiple times." Mrs. Pritchard tilted her head, bird-like. One does wonder why a man of his station would have business with someone so far beneath his notice. The words landed exactly as intended, soft enough to claim innocence, sharp enough to draw blood. "Perhaps he's charitable," Eliza said quietly. "Charitable." Mrs. Pritchard's laugh was delicate, poisonous. "Yes. Some might call it that." Thomas stirred against Eliza's chest, making a small sound. All three women's eyes fixed on him with the intensity of hawks spotting prey. "He's a beautiful child," the second young woman said. "Such refined features. Almost aristocratic, wouldn't you say?" The implication hung in the cold morning air. Eliza felt something harden in her chest, something that had been soft and vulnerable crystallizing into something sharper. She met Mrs. Pritchard's gaze directly. "If you have accusations to make them clearly. I won't stand here and decipher insults dressed as concern." Mrs. Pritchard's eyebrows rose. "Accusations? My dear, no one is accusing you of anything. We're simply noting coincidences, as any concerned neighbor would." "Of course." Eliza shifted the bucket. "If you'll excuse me." She walked away with as much dignity as she could gather, feeling their eyes on her back like physical weight. The whispers resumed before she'd gone 10 paces, lower now, more urgent, gleeful with the confirmation of their suspicions. By afternoon, the damage had spread. Eliza felt it in the way the butcher's wife avoided her eyes when she came to purchase meat, in how conversation ceased when she entered the general store, resuming only after she'd left with a false brightness that fooled no one. Mr. Crawford, who'd always been kind, now served her with stiff formality and wouldn't meet her gaze. The baker handed over her bread without his usual warm greeting. Even the children playing in the street grew quiet as she passed, watching with the cruel curiosity of youth. She was being marked, categorized, judged. By the time she returned home, Thomas fussing for his afternoon feeding, Eliza's hands were trembling not from cold but from the weight of all those watching eyes. She'd known this would come. The Duke had warned her. But knowing and experiencing were different creatures entirely. The knock came just after sunset. Eliza's heart leapt before fear could catch it. She opened the door to find not the Duke but his coachman, a weathered man named Davies who'd delivered supplies before but never spoken beyond necessity. "Miss Moore." He touched his cap. "Begging your pardon for the late hour. Is something wrong?" "No, miss. But his lordship asked me to deliver this." He held out a folded note, sealed with wax. "And to tell you," he hesitated, visibly uncomfortable, "to tell you he won't be able to visit for a while. For your protection," he said. The words struck harder than they should have. Eliza took the note with numb fingers. "I see. Thank you, Davies." "Miss," the coachman glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "For what it's worth, his lordship is not what they're saying. What they're thinking." "What are they saying?" Davies's expression darkened. "That you're his mistress. That the child is, well, that he's been keeping you." He met her eyes with surprising directness. "But I've served Lord Hawthorne 15 years. I know when a man's entangled in sin, and I know when he's trying to do right by a situation with no right answers. This is the latter." Eliza felt her throat tighten. "Thank you for that. Just thought you should know someone sees clear. Not everyone believes the worst." He touched his cap again. "I'll be going, miss. You take care." He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Eliza standing in her doorway with a sealed note and the cold reality of isolation settling around her shoulders. Inside, she fed Thomas, then settled him in his cradle before finally opening the letter. The handwriting was precise, controlled, everything about it screamed restraint. "Miss Moore, by the time you receive this, I suspect you will have encountered the consequences of my thoughtlessness. I should have known that my visits, however careful, would not go unnoticed in a village where privacy is a luxury and speculation a currency. I am withdrawing for a time, not out of cowardice, but because my presence endangers you further. Every visit confirms their suspicions. Every moment I spend near you adds weight to rumors I cannot defend against without revealing truths that would destroy more than reputations. I have arranged for Davies to deliver supplies weekly. He is discreet and loyal beyond question. You will want for nothing material. But I know that is cold comfort when weighed against the isolation you now face because of choices I made. Forgive me for asking you to bear this burden. Forgive me for not anticipating its weight. And know that my absence is not abandonment, merely the only protection I can offer. Tell Thomas, no. There is nothing I can tell him that would mean anything. Tell yourself, instead, that I am grateful beyond words. That I think of you both constantly. That I would undo this entire situation if I could, except that undoing it would mean my son never knowing you, and that would be an even greater tragedy. Yours in debt and unworthiness. A.H. Eliza read it twice, then a third time, trying to find anger in the words. But all she felt was the ache of recognition, of two people trapped in a situation neither had chosen, both trying to protect a child while drowning in the cost. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the small box where she kept Thomas's things, his soft cap, the blanket he'd arrived in, the few precious items that marked his existence. Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake catching lamplight before disappearing into darkness. And Eliza sat alone in her cottage, listening to Thomas's soft breathing, feeling the village's judgment pressing against her walls like winter cold, wondering how long she could bear the weight of love that offered everything and nothing simultaneously. A week passed. Then, too, the isolation deepened. Women who'd once smiled now crossed the street when they saw her coming. The vicar's wife, who'd always been kind, now offered only pinched sympathy and advice about seeking forgiveness for past mistakes. Davies came weekly, as promised, always at dusk when fewer eyes might notice. He brought food, firewood, coin in small leather pouches that Eliza accepted with diminishing pride. Survival, she was learning, required swallowing things that tasted like shame. But the supplies meant nothing against the loneliness. Against the way her own neighbors treated her like contagion made flesh. Against the creeping fear that Thomas would grow up marked by association, forever carrying the stain of secrets and whispers. She began to understand what the Duke had meant about the cost being more than he had the right to ask. And yet, when Thomas smiled at her, those first real smiles that lit his whole face with uncomplicated joy, she found she would pay the price again. And again. And again. Even if it meant standing alone against the judgment of everyone who thought they knew her story. Even if it meant never seeing the Duke again, never feeling that dangerous warmth of being seen by someone who understood impossible choices. Even if it meant becoming the villain in someone else's narrative so a child could simply be loved. The snow continued falling through February, covering everything in cold, pristine white. And in her small cottage, Eliza Moore learned that love's truest form sometimes looked like sacrifice without witness, courage without recognition, and endurance without hope of rescue. Thomas thrived. And that, she told herself on the hardest days, was the only thing that mattered. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne received her intelligence the way she received everything, with perfect composure and immediate calculation. Mrs. Crawford stood before her in the drawing-room, hands folded precisely at her waist, reporting the information she'd gathered with the clinical efficiency Beatrice had always admired in her staff. The woman's name is Eliza Moore. A widow, my lady. Or perhaps never married, accounts differ. She lives in a cottage on the south edge of the village. And the child? Beatrice's voice was cool, betraying nothing. A boy. 4 months old, by most estimates. She appeared with him quite suddenly last autumn. Suddenly? Yes, my lady. The village believes, Mrs. Crawford hesitated, choosing her words with visible care. The village believes the child is his lordship's. Beatrice set down her teacup with perfect precision. The china met the saucer without a sound. Based on what evidence? His lordship has been seen visiting the cottage. Multiple times. His coachman delivers supplies weekly. Mrs. Crawford's expression remained professionally neutral. The timing is suggestive, my lady. I see. Beatrice rose, moving to the window that overlooked her perfectly maintained gardens. Winter had stripped them bare, revealing the geometric precision of their design. Everything in its proper place. Everything controlled. And what does the woman claim? She claims nothing, my lady. She accepts the speculation without defense or explanation. Which suggests either guilt or pride. Beatrice's reflection in the glass showed no emotion. How fascinating. Shall I continue investigating, my lady? No. The word was sharp, decisive. You've done well, Mrs. Crawford. But from this point, I'll handle matters personally. The housekeeper's surprise was nearly invisible, but Beatrice caught it. Good. Let her staff wonder. Let them speculate about what their mistress might do with such information. Will there be anything else, my lady? Send word to prepare my carriage. I'll be going out this afternoon. Certainly, my lady. May I ask the destination? Beatrice turned from the window, her expression as cold and beautiful as the winter landscape. I'm going to pay a call on Miss Moore. It seems only proper that I meet the woman who's been caring for my husband's interests. Mrs. Crawford's eyes widened fractionally. My lady, if I may. You may not. Beatrice's voice remained perfectly pleasant. That will be all, Mrs. Crawford. The housekeeper left quickly, leaving Beatrice alone with her thoughts and the cold satisfaction of purpose. The carriage ride to the village was brief, far too brief for Beatrice's liking. She would have preferred more time to arrange her thoughts, to perfect the performance she was about to deliver. But some opportunities required speed over perfection. She dressed carefully. Nothing too grand, that would seem like she was trying to intimidate. But nothing modest either. The deep burgundy velvet, the understated jewelry, the fur-lined cloak, all spoke of unquestionable quality, of a woman who knew her worth without needing to shout it. The cottage, when they reached it, was exactly as Beatrice had imagined, small, plain, unremarkable. The sort of dwelling a man might choose for a mistress he wanted kept conveniently close but thoroughly hidden. She descended from the carriage without waiting for assistance, ignoring her driver's startled expression. Let him be startled. Let the entire village talk about Lady Hawthorne appearing on Eliza Moore's doorstep. Sometimes visibility was its own weapon. She knocked firmly. Once. Twice. The door opened. The woman who stood before her was younger than Beatrice had expected, perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple arrangement and eyes that held more wariness than fear. She wore a plain dress, mended in several places, and in her arms she held an infant wrapped in blankets that were clean but clearly not new. Miss Moore, I presume. Yes. The woman's voice was steady. And you are? Lady Beatrice Hawthorne. She let the name settle between them like a blade placed carefully on a table. I believe we have much to discuss. To her credit, Eliza Moore didn't flinch, didn't pale, simply shifted the baby slightly in her arms and stepped back from the doorway. You'd better come in. The cottage's interior matched its exterior, modest, clean, spare. A single room serving as kitchen, living space, and nursery. A fire burned low in the hearth. The air smelled of milk and wood smoke and something else, something Beatrice recognized with distaste as the particular warmth of a place where a child was loved. She remained standing, unwilling to sit in this space that felt like an accusation against everything her own home represented. I'll be direct, Beatrice said. The village believes this child is my husband's. The village believes many things. Is it true? Eliza met her gaze without evasion. What does your husband say? My husband says nothing. Which is, in itself, rather telling. Beatrice's eyes moved to the baby, studying him with the analytical precision she brought to evaluating artwork. Dark hair. Fine features. Nothing conclusive, but nothing dismissive either. He's healthy, I see. Very. And you care for him alone. I do. How maternal of you. Beatrice's voice dripped acid sweetness. Tell me, Miss Moore, did my husband offer you money? A settlement? Or do you support his child out of the goodness of your heart? Something flickered in Eliza's expression, not shame, but something sharper. I don't see how that's your concern. Don't you? Beatrice stepped closer, her voice dropping to something cold and intimate. Everything that touches my husband's name touches mine. Everything that threatens his reputation threatens my position. So yes, Miss Moore, it is very much my concern. Then perhaps you should be having this conversation with him. Perhaps I should. Beatrice circled slowly, examining the cottage like a general surveying a battlefield. But he's proven remarkably uncommunicative. Men often are, I find, when they've entangled themselves in situations they'd rather not explain. She stopped in front of a small wooden cradle, noting its crude construction, the worn blankets tucked inside. You must understand my position. I am Lady Hawthorne. I have certain expectations, standards to maintain. And then I discover that my husband has been visiting a woman in the village, that this woman has a child of suspicious origins, and that he's been providing for them both with a frequency that suggests more than charity. What do you want? Eliza's voice had hardened. Want? Beatrice turned, and her smile was terrible in its perfection. I want many things, Miss Moore. I want to know the truth. I want to understand what claim, if any, you think you have on my husband. I want to determine whether you're a threat to be eliminated or simply a temporary embarrassment to be managed. I'm neither. Everyone is one or the other. Beatrice moved toward the door, then paused. Let me be clear. I don't know what arrangement you have with my husband. I don't particularly care. But if you imagine that his visits, his supplies, his attention mean anything more than convenient disposal of an inconvenient problem, you're more foolish than I thought. I've imagined nothing. Good. Keep it that way. Beatrice's hand rested on the door latch. My husband is bound to me by law, by contract, by every social structure that matters in our world. Whatever you think you have, whatever his promised or implied, means nothing against that reality. Do you understand? Eliza's arms tightened around the baby. I understand that you're afraid. The words landed like a slap. Beatrice's composure cracked, just for an instant, fury flashing across her features before she mastered it. Afraid. Of you. Of losing control. Eliza's voice was quiet but unwavering. Of something existing that you can't manage or contain or fit into your perfect world. That's what frightens you. Not me. Not this child. Just the idea that something might matter more to your husband than maintaining appearances. Silence filled the cottage like water rising. When Beatrice spoke again, her voice was soft and deadly. You're right to be careful, Miss Moore. Because I will not allow anything, or anyone, to threaten what I've built. If this child is my husband's, I'll know it. And when I do, I'll decide what becomes of him. Not you. Not even Alistair. Me. She opened the door, cold air rushing in. Enjoy your little sanctuary while it lasts. Nothing stays hidden forever. Beatrice descended to her carriage, spine perfectly straight, face composed. Inside, something cold and vicious had taken root, not jealousy, because that required caring whether her husband loved another woman. But possession. Territory. The absolute refusal to be made a fool. As the carriage pulled away, she allowed herself one glance back at the cottage. That woman, that nothing of a woman, had dared to look at her with pity. Had dared to suggest that Lady Beatrice Hawthorne was afraid. She wasn't afraid. She was simply preparing for war. And in war, Beatrice had learned long ago, there were no rules except winning. Alistair learned of his wife's visit from Davies, who arrived at his study with the kind of careful urgency that meant something had gone terribly wrong. My lord. The coachman's voice was low. I thought you should know. Lady Hawthorne went to the village yesterday afternoon. Alistair's hand stilled over the papers he'd been reviewing. Where in the village? To Miss Moore's cottage, my lord. The words hit like a physical blow. Alistair rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. How long was she there? Perhaps 20 minutes. She went alone, sent me back here with the carriage. Davies shifted uncomfortably. The whole village saw, my lord. They are talking. Of course they are. Alistair moved to the window, gripping the sill with white-knuckled hands. Outside, his estate stretched in orderly perfection, land that had belonged to his family for generations, responsibility that weighed like chains. Did Miss Moore send word? No, my lord. Which meant either Beatrice had done no damage, or the damage was so severe that Eliza couldn't risk communication. Alistair's chest tightened with something close to panic. "Prepare the carriage. I'm going to the village." "My lord," Davies hesitated. "Forgive me, but is that wise? If Lady Hawthorne discovers—" "She already knows, Davies. Or suspects enough that the distinction hardly matters." Alistair reached for his coat. "The time for caution has passed." The ride to the village felt interminable despite its brevity. Alistair's mind conjured a dozen scenarios, each worse than the last. Beatrice threatening Eliza, demanding the child, using her position to crush a woman who had no defense against aristocratic power. He should have anticipated this. Should have known that distance wouldn't protect anyone, that his wife's need for control would eventually drive her to confront what she couldn't contain. The cottage appeared unchanged, small, modest, smoke rising from the chimney. But everything felt different now, contaminated by Beatrice's presence, by the collision of two worlds that should never have touched. Alistair knocked, then realized how absurd the formality was. He pushed the door open. "Eliza!" She sat by the fire, Thomas sleeping in her lap, and looked up at his entrance with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear. Not anger. Something quieter and more devastating. Resignation, perhaps. Or simply exhaustion. "She came," Eliza said. "Not a question." "I know. I'm sorry. I should have." "Should have what?" She stroked Thomas's dark hair gently. "Hidden us better. Visited less. There was no version of this that ended differently, Alistair. We both knew that." The sound of his name in her voice, familiar now, intimate despite everything, made his chest ache. He closed the door and moved closer, though he didn't sit. "What did she say?" "What you'd expect. That I'm nothing. That any claim I might think I have means nothing against her legal bonds to you." Eliza's voice remained steady. "She threatened to take him. Said she'd decide what becomes of him." Rage flooded through Alistair, hot and immediate. "She has no right." "She has every right." Eliza looked at him directly. "She's your wife. In the eyes of everyone who matters, any child you father, legitimate or not, falls under her authority as much as yours." "The law." "The law." Eliza's laugh was soft, bitter. "The law wasn't written for women like me, Alistair. It was written for women like her. For men like you. I have no legal claim to Thomas. No protection. Nothing but what you choose to give me, and even that exists only at your wife's sufferance." The truth of it settled between them like ash. Alistair sank into the chair across from her, suddenly feeling every weight he'd been carrying. "I won't let her take him." "How will you stop her?" He stopped, confronted by the impossible mathematics of power. He was a duke. He could command servants, influence politics, move through the world with the ease of someone born to authority. But against his own wife, operating within the legal structures of marriage and legitimacy, his power meant nothing. Less than nothing. "I'll find a way." "Will you?" Eliza's eyes held his, searching. "Or will you do what powerful men always do, find a compromise that protects your position while sacrificing what you claim to care about?" "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" She shifted Thomas slightly, his small body adjusting in sleep. "I don't blame you, Alistair. I understood the terms when I accepted him. But let's not pretend you have choices you don't actually have. You're bound to her. By law, by society, by everything that makes you who you are." "I could leave her." The words emerged before he'd fully thought them through. But once spoken, they hung in the air between them, impossible and undeniable. Eliza's expression softened with something that looked like grief. "No. You couldn't." "I could. I could petition for separation, take Thomas, provide for you both properly." "And lose everything." Her voice was gentle now, almost tender. "Your title. Your standing. Your ability to protect us. Do you think your wife would let you simply walk away? She'd fight you, Publicly. She'd drag every detail into the light, and Thomas would become not just illegitimate but notorious. So I do nothing. I let her threaten you, dictate terms, treat my son like property to be negotiated. You choose. Eliza met his eyes. You choose what you can live with, what you're willing to sacrifice. Because there's no version of this where everyone survives intact. Alistair stood abruptly, unable to sit under the weight of her words. He moved to the window, looking out at the village where people were probably still talking, still speculating, still judging. I never meant for any of this, he said quietly. When I brought him to you, I thought I was saving him, giving him a chance at life, at love. But all I've done is endanger everyone He stopped. Everyone you what? He turned to face her. The firelight caught in her hair, illuminated the curve of her cheek, the strength in her posture despite everything arrayed against her. And he realized with sudden, devastating clarity that somewhere between desperate midnight arrival and stolen afternoon visits, between watching her feed his son and teaching him how to hold an infant without fear, he'd begun to feel something he had no right to feel. Everyone I care about, he finished, the words inadequate for what churned beneath them. Eliza's expression shifted, recognition flickering in her eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like pain. Don't, she whispered. Don't what? Don't make this harder than it already is. She looked down at Thomas, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his small head. We can survive your wife's threats. We can survive the village's judgment. But we can't survive you caring about me as anything more than the woman raising your child. Why not? Because it changes everything. Her voice broke slightly. Because it makes this about more than protecting Thomas. It makes it about wanting something we can never have. And that kind of wanting destroys people, Alistair. It makes them reckless. Makes them believe in possibilities that don't exist. He crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair so their eyes were level. What if I'm already reckless? What if I already believe? Then you're a fool. But her eyes glistened with unshed tears. And I'm a greater fool for wishing you weren't wrong. Thomas stirred between them, making small sounds of waking. Eliza wiped quickly at her eyes, composing herself before the baby could open his eyes and see her distress. Alistair reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on Thomas's back. Her fingers were cold, trembling. His own shook too. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. I don't know how to protect you both and maintain the position that lets me protect you. I don't know how to choose between duty and, he stopped. And. Eliza prompted softly. And home, he finished. Because that's what this feels like. Not the estate, not my title, not the marriage I'm bound to. This. You. Him. This small cottage where I can breathe without performing. Where I'm not the Duke but simply a man who made terrible choices and found grace he didn't deserve. A tear slipped down Eliza's cheek. You need to leave. Eliza. Please. Before we say things that can't be unsaid. Before we make this about us instead of him. She looked down at Thomas, who was fully awake now, blinking up at them both. Is all that matters. You know that. Alistair did know. But knowing and accepting were different animals entirely. The summons came on a morning when frost still clung to the windows like accusations made visible. A formal letter, delivered by a servant Eliza didn't recognize, written in script so perfect it seemed weaponized. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne requested, no, demanded, Miss Moore's presence at Hawthorne Manor at 2 o'clock that afternoon. The reason was not stated. It didn't need to be. Eliza read it 3 times, her hands steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. She looked at Thomas, playing on a blanket by the fire, babbling to himself with the uncomplicated joy of a child who didn't yet understand danger. She could refuse. Simply not appear. But refusing would only delay the inevitable, and Beatrice would interpret it as weakness or guilt. Neither was an impression Eliza could afford. So at 1:30, she dressed in her only good dress, plain dark wool, mended but clean, and wrapped Thomas in his warmest blankets. Mrs. Hewitt next door agreed to watch him, asking no questions but offering sympathy in her silence. "If I'm not back by evening," Eliza said quietly, "send word to Davies, the Duke's coachman." Mrs. Hewitt's eyes widened, but she nodded. "Be careful, dear." Eliza walked to the manor. It took 40 minutes, uphill most of the way, and by the time she reached the iron gates her feet ached and her breath came in visible clouds. The estate loomed before her, vast, imposing, everything her cottage was not. A servant met her at the door, his expression carefully neutral, and led her through corridors that seemed designed to intimidate. High ceilings, portrait-lined walls, the accumulated weight of generations staring down at those who didn't belong. She was shown into a drawing room that could have held her entire cottage twice over. Lady Beatrice sat in a chair positioned to catch the afternoon light, arranged as deliberately as everything else in her life. But she wasn't alone. Alistair stood by the window, his back rigid, hands clasped behind him. He didn't turn when Eliza entered, but she saw his shoulders tense. And beside Beatrice, in a chair clearly chosen for its authority, sat an older gentleman Eliza didn't recognize, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, radiating the particular power of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Moore." Beatrice's voice was silk over steel. "How prompt. Do sit." Eliza remained standing. "I prefer not to." "As you wish." Beatrice gestured to the older man. "This is Mr. Whitmore, my family's solicitor." The word settled into Eliza's stomach like lead. A solicitor meant documents, legal proceedings, the machinery of law being brought to bear against someone with no defense. "Lady Hawthorne has asked me here," Whitmore said, his voice professionally dispassionate, "to discuss the matter of the child currently in your care." "Thomas," Eliza said firmly. "His name is Thomas. The child's name is irrelevant to the legal proceedings." Whitmore opened a leather case, withdrawing papers. "What matters is his parentage and the question of his proper guardianship." Alistair finally turned from the window. "This is unnecessary, Beatrice." "Is it?" His wife's eyes never left Eliza. "I disagree. Miss Moore has been caring for a child she has no legal right to. A child who may, or may not, have claims on the Hawthorne name. That seems very necessary to clarify." "He has no claims," Alistair said. "I've made that clear." "Have you?" Beatrice tilted her head. "Because your behavior suggests otherwise. The visits, the financial support, the obvious attachment." She let the word hang, poisonous. "One might interpret such actions as acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, Mr. Whitmore, creates legal complications," the solicitor finished. "If Lord Hawthorne has effectively acknowledged paternity through his actions, the child could potentially make claims on the estate, despite his illegitimacy. Which is why," Beatrice continued smoothly, "we must resolve this matter. Clearly. Legally. Permanently." Eliza's throat tightened. "What are you proposing?" "Simple terms." Beatrice's smile was terrible in its precision. "You will relinquish all custody of the child. He will be placed in an institution, a reputable one, I assure you, where he will be cared for appropriately. You will receive a sum of money sufficient to relocate far from this village. And you will sign documents swearing you will never contact my husband or the child again." The words struck like blows. Eliza felt the room tilt, her vision narrowing. "No." The word emerged stronger than she felt. Beatrice's eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon." "No." Eliza's hands clenched at her sides. "I won't give him up. I won't send him to an institution where he'll be raised without love, without—" "Without what?" Beatrice interrupted. "A mother. But you're not his mother, Miss Moore. You're simply the woman who's been paid to care for him." "I've never been paid. The supplies my husband sends. The money left at your door. What would you call that? Support for his child. Not payment for my silence." "Semantics." Beatrice waved her hand dismissively. "The point remains, You have no legal standing, no rights. The child could be removed from your care today, this very moment, and you would have no recourse. Beatrice, enough. Alistair's voice was sharp. This isn't necessary. Isn't it? His wife stood, moving toward him with calculated grace. You created this situation, Alistair. Your moment of weakness, your inability to handle your responsibilities discreetly, your ridiculous attachment to playing the concerned father. And now I'm cleaning up your mess. He's not a mess, Eliza said, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. He's a child. A baby who deserves love and protection, not to be negotiated like property. Love. Beatrice laughed, the sound crystalline and cruel. How sentimental. But love doesn't feed children, Miss Moore. Love doesn't provide security or education or future prospects. My husband's name does. My position does. And I will not allow either to be compromised by your domestic fantasies. Then what do you want? Eliza turned to Alistair, desperate. Tell me what you want. His face was anguished, trapped. I want my son safe. I want him loved. I want. You want everything, Beatrice interrupted. The respectability of our marriage, the comfort of your little escape in the village, the satisfaction of playing benevolent father without any of the consequences. But you cannot have everything, my dear husband. So choose. The room fell silent except for the crackling fire. Choose what? Alistair's voice was barely audible. Choose whether you want your son raised in obscurity by this woman with no name, no protection, vulnerable to every wind that blows. Or, Beatrice paused, and something calculating flickered in her eyes. You acknowledge him. Publicly. Legitimize him as much as law allows. Bring him into our household under my guardianship. What? The word came from both Alistair and Eliza simultaneously. I'll raise him, Beatrice said, her voice perfectly composed. As my own. With all the advantages of the Hawthorne name, all the protection of legitimacy. He'll want for nothing material. He'll be educated, positioned for whatever future his birth allows. And what would you demand in return? Alistair asked, suspicion evident. Simple things. Beatrice's smile was cold triumph. You end all contact with Miss Moore. You give me complete authority over the child's upbringing. You never question my decisions regarding him. And you fulfill, finally, your obligations as my husband, including providing me with a legitimate heir. The terms landed like stones in water, ripples spreading outward. Eliza felt something crack inside her chest. You'd use him. As leverage. As is my right. Beatrice turned to her. I'm offering him a life you could never provide. Name. Status. Future. All he needs to do is never see you again. Beatrice, this is, Alistair's voice was strangled. This is reality, his wife finished. So decide, husband. Your illegitimate son raised in poverty and whispers, or raised in privilege without her. She gestured toward Eliza with casual dismissal. You cannot have both. Alistair looked at Eliza, and she saw everything in his eyes, apology, agony, love he couldn't speak, choice he couldn't make. And Eliza understood, with devastating clarity, that there was only one way this could end. Eliza spoke before Alistair could. I'll go. The words fell into the drawing room's tense silence like stones into still water. Alistair's head snapped toward her, his expression stricken. Eliza, no. I'll leave the village, she continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I'll sign whatever documents you require. But I have conditions. Beatrice's eyes narrowed with interest. You're hardly in a position to make demands. Perhaps not. But you want this resolved cleanly, don't you? Eliza met the other woman's gaze directly. No scandal. No questions. No whispers that follow your family for generations. I can give you that. But not on your terms. On mine. Mr. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles. Lady Hawthorne, perhaps we should hear. Be silent. Beatrice's attention remained fixed on Eliza. What conditions? Thomas stays with me. Not in an institution. Not in this house. With me. Absolutely not. Let her finish, Alistair said quietly, his voice carrying a note of authority that made even Beatrice pause. Eliza drew a breath, knowing she was gambling everything on one desperate play. You want him gone so he can't threaten your position. I understand. But sending him to an institution creates exactly what you're trying to avoid: questions, investigations, paper trails that lead back to this family. Whereas if he simply disappears into obscurity with me, if we leave and never return, then the village gossip dies with our departure. And what stops you from making claims later? Whitmore asked. From reappearing when the child is older. A contract. Binding. I'll swear that Thomas is my son, born before I came to this village. I'll never name his father. I'll never contact this family. I'll raise him far from here, where no one knows the Hawthorne name. Her voice wavered slightly. All I ask is that you let me keep him, and that you provide enough support for us to live modestly. Not wealth. Just enough. Beatrice studied her with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Why should I trust you? Because I love him. Eliza's voice broke on the words. Because unlike you, I don't see him as leverage or liability. I see him as a child who deserves a chance at happiness, even if that happiness is humble. I'll protect him from your world, and in doing so, I'll protect you from scandal. And my husband's visits. End today. Forever. Eliza forced herself not to look at Alistair. We disappear completely. You'll never see either of us again. The room fell silent except for the fire's crackle and Alistair's sharp intake of breath. No. His voice was raw. Eliza, you can't. I can. She finally met his eyes, and the pain in them nearly broke her resolve. This is the only way everyone survives. Your son grows up loved. Your wife maintains her position. You fulfill your duties without the weight of impossible choices. And I, her voice caught, I get to keep the child I love more than my own life. At the cost of everything else, Alistair said hoarsely. Your home. Your neighbors. Any future you might have had here. What future did I have? Eliza's smile was sad, knowing. As the village scandal? As the woman whispered about whenever I walk past? You gave me Thomas. That's more future than I ever expected. Beatrice rose, moving to the window where Alistair had stood earlier. She was silent for a long moment, calculating, weighing options with the precision she brought to everything. Where would you go? She asked finally. North. Scotland, perhaps. Somewhere remote enough that no one asks questions about a widow raising her son alone. You'd need funds. Relocation costs. A cottage. Expenses for the child's upbringing. A modest sum would suffice. I'm not greedy, Lady Hawthorne. I'm simply trying to save us all from ruin. Beatrice turned, and something like grudging respect flickered in her expression. You're cleverer than I credited. This solution serves you as much as it serves me. It serves Thomas, Eliza corrected. That's all I care about. Mr. Whitmore. Beatrice's voice was crisp, decisive. Draw up the papers. Miss Moore will attest that the child is hers, conceived before arriving in this village. She will receive a settlement, modest but sufficient, in exchange for a binding agreement never to contact this family or make any claims regarding the Hawthorne name. All parties will sign today. My lady, I should advise. Your advice is noted and dismissed. Prepare the documents. The solicitor bowed and withdrew, leaving the three of them in weighted silence. I need to speak with her, Alistair said. Alone. Absolutely not. Beatrice's voice was sharp. 5 minutes, Beatrice. You've won. Allow me this." The request, the acknowledgement of her victory, seemed to satisfy something in Beatrice. She inclined her head with cold grace. 5 minutes. I'll be in the hall. Watching the clock. She swept from the room, leaving them alone for the first time since Eliza had entered this monument to everything they could never be. Alistair closed the distance between them in 3 strides, his hands grasping her shoulders with barely controlled desperation. "Don't do this. I have to. There must be another way." "There isn't." Eliza reached up, covering his hands with hers. "You know there isn't. This is the only ending where Thomas survives intact. Where he grows up whole instead of torn between worlds. He grows up without his father. He grows up without knowing what is missing. That's a mercy, Alistair." Tears slipped down her cheeks now, unchecked. Better that than growing up knowing his father chose duty over him. "I'm not choosing. You are. We both are. We're choosing him." Her voice steadied with fierce certainty. "We're choosing his happiness over our own. Isn't that what love is? Real love?" Alistair's face crumpled with anguish. He pulled her against him, heedless of propriety or consequence, and she felt his breath shudder against her hair. "I can't lose you both. You never had us. Not really. Not in any way that could last." She pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of him one last time, soap and wool and something uniquely him that she would carry in memory for the rest of her life. "But this way, Thomas has a chance. That's what you wanted when you brought him to my door. Remember? A chance. I never meant for you to disappear. I know." She pulled back enough to look at him, memorizing every line of his face. "But sometimes love means disappearing. Means being the ghost that protects instead of the presence that destroys. How do I live with this?" His voice broke. "How do I wake every day knowing my son is somewhere out there, and I'll never see his face? Never hear his voice? Never watch him become whoever he's meant to be? The same way I'll live knowing I took him from his father." Eliza touched his face gently, a gesture of intimacy they'd never allowed themselves before. "With the knowledge that we both loved him enough to break our own hearts. I love you too." The words escaped him like a confession torn from his chest. "God help me, I love you too. I know." Fresh tears spilled over. "I've known since the day you couldn't hold him without trembling. Since the day you looked at this cottage like it was sanctuary instead of poverty. I've known, and I've loved you back, and that's why I have to go. Because you love me. Because loving you would mean using Thomas as an excuse to stay. Would mean choosing what I want over what he needs. And I can't, I won't, do that to him." She stepped back, forcing distance between them. "He deserves better than being the chain that binds us together." Alistair stood frozen, his arms falling to his sides as though he'd forgotten how they worked. "Tell me his name," he whispered. "The name you call him when you're alone. The name he'll carry when you're gone." "Thomas." Her voice was barely audible. "Thomas More. After my father. After a man who was kind and loved without condition. That's who he'll become. Thomas." Alistair repeated it like a prayer. "Will you tell him about me? When he's older? I'll tell him his father loved him so much he gave him away to keep him safe. I'll tell him that sometimes the bravest thing a parent can do is let go." She wiped at her eyes. "I won't let him hate you, Alistair. I promise." The door opened. Beatrice stood in the threshold, Mr. Whitmore behind her with papers in hand. "Time is concluded," she announced. Eliza and Alistair looked at each other one final time. Two people who'd found impossible love in an impossible situation, now choosing impossible sacrifice. "Be happy," Eliza whispered. "Somehow." "Keep him safe," Alistair answered. "That's all I ask." She nodded and turned toward Beatrice and the waiting documents that would sever every legal connection between the Duke and his son. Between a man and the woman he loved. between a family that could never be and the lonely futures they would each face. Mr. Whitmore spread papers across a writing desk. Eliza read them with numb focus, signed with a steady hand that betrayed none of the trembling in her soul. Alistair signed as witness, his signature, usually so precise, wavering slightly. Beatrice signed last, her expression unreadable. "The settlement will be delivered to you tomorrow," she said. "I suggest you be gone within the week." "We will be." Eliza gathered the papers Mr. Whitmore handed her, proof of transaction, of severance, of ending. "Thank you for your generosity." "Don't thank me." Beatrice's voice was cold. "I'm simply ensuring my interests are protected. What happens to you beyond that is of no concern to me." Eliza nodded and turned toward the door. "Miss Moore." She stopped, looked back. Alistair stood by the window again, his back to her, shoulders rigid with controlled grief. "Take care of yourself," he said without turning. "Please." "You too," she whispered. Then she left Hawthorne Manor, walked back down the hill to her cottage, and began the work of packing a life into boxes small enough to carry into exile. Mrs. Hewitt returned Thomas, who smiled at the sight of her with such uncomplicated joy that Eliza had to turn away to hide fresh tears. "We're going on an adventure," she told him, her voice bright and false. "Just you and me. Somewhere new. Somewhere safe." Thomas babbled happily, reaching for her face with his small hands, trusting her completely. And Eliza held him close and tried not to think about the man standing alone in a vast drawing room, staring out at gardens he could walk but not escape, trapped by duty and title and the terrible cost of doing what was right. 7 years later. The cottage overlooked the sea. It wasn't grand, nothing in Eliza's life would ever be grand again, but it was theirs. Whitewashed stone, a thatched roof that needed mending each spring, windows that rattled when the wind came off the water. But inside there was warmth and laughter, and a small boy who was learning to read by the fire while rain drummed against the glass. "Mamma, what does this word say?" Thomas looked up from his primer, dark eyes bright with curiosity beneath equally dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that still, after all these years, made Eliza's breath catch. "Sound it out," she said gently, setting down her mending. "You know the letters. See our age." He pronounced it carefully. "Courage." "Very good." She smiled, reaching over to smooth his hair, an automatic gesture born from years of love and protection. "Do you know what it means?" Thomas scrunched his face in thought. "Being brave." "More than that. Being brave even when you're frightened. Even when doing the right thing costs you everything you hold dear." Her voice softened. "It's the hardest thing in the world, and the most important." "Like in the story you tell? About my father?" The question shouldn't have surprised her. Thomas asked about his father often now that he was 7, old enough to notice other children had 2 parents while he had only 1. But it still landed like a hand pressed against an old wound. "Yes," she said quietly. "Like that." "Tell me again." Eliza set aside her mending entirely and pulled Thomas into her lap. He was getting too big for this, really, all long limbs and boundless energy, but he curled against her shoulder the way he had as an infant, seeking the comfort of closeness. "Your father," she began, as she always did, "was a good man trapped by circumstances he couldn't control. He loved you very much, so much that he made the hardest choice a parent can make. He let you go so you could be free." "Free from what?" "From expectations. From a life that would have demanded you be someone other than who you truly are." She kissed the top of his head. "He gave you the gift of choosing your own path. Do you think he remembers me? Every day. Every moment. The way I think of him. I know he does. A father doesn't forget his son just because distance separates them." Will I ever meet him? The question she'd been dreading. The answer she'd prepared but hoped never to give. I don't know, my love. Perhaps someday, when you're grown. Perhaps then you'll seek him out and make your own peace with the past. She pulled back to look at his face, so serious now, so much like Alistair's when he was working through impossible problems. But until then, you're my Thomas. And that's enough, isn't it? He nodded, satisfied for now, and returned to his reading. Eliza watched him, this miracle of a child who'd grown into a bright, kind boy despite, or perhaps because of, the sacrifice that had bought his freedom. He would never want for food or shelter. The settlement Beatrice had provided was invested carefully, producing enough income for modest security. He would never know wealth, but he would know love. Sometimes, on nights when the wind was particularly fierce and sleep eluded her, Eliza wondered if she'd made the right choice. If condemning herself to loneliness and Alistair to a lifetime of not knowing his son was truly the best path. But then Thomas would laugh at something simple, a bird landing on the windowsill, a particularly good sentence in his reading, and she would know. He was happy, whole, unbroken by the weight of secrets and scandal. That was worth any price. A knock at the door startled them both. Visitors were rare here, in this remote corner of Scotland where the nearest village was an hour's walk and neighbours respected privacy as a form of currency. Eliza opened the door cautiously. A man stood there, weathered by travel, dressed in plain clothes that nonetheless couldn't disguise their quality. For a moment she didn't recognize him, then her heart stopped. Davies, the Duke's coachman. Miss Moore. He touched his cap, his expression apologetic. Forgive the intrusion. Davies. Her voice came out strangled. She glanced back at Thomas, who was watching with curious interest, then stepped outside, pulling the door mostly closed. What are you doing here? I've come with a message. And a request. He reached into his coat and withdrew a letter, sealed with wax but bearing no family crest. From his lordship. Eliza's hands trembled as she took it. Is he well? As well as can be expected. Davies's expression softened. Lady Hawthorne passed 6 months ago. Fever. It was quick. The news should have brought something, relief, perhaps, or satisfaction that the woman who'd orchestrated their separation was gone. But all Eliza felt was a hollow sadness for a life lived without warmth, without love, ending as coldly as it had been lived. I'm sorry for his loss. He asked me to find you. It wasn't easy, you've hidden yourselves well, but I've been searching for the better part of a year. Davies nodded toward the letter. He wants to see you. Both of you. If you'll allow it. Eliza's breath caught. I can't. The agreement. The agreement was with Lady Hawthorne. She's gone. And his lordship. Miss Moore, he's spent 7 years doing his duty. 7 years in a marriage that was never more than contract, fulfilling obligations that hollowed him out. Now he's free, and the first thing, the only thing, he wants is to see his son. And you. It's been 7 years, Davies. We're not the same people. No, the coachman agreed. You're both people who've survived loving each other enough to let go. That seems like a stronger foundation than most marriages start with. Eliza looked down at the sealed letter, feeling its weight, not of paper but of possibility, of choices that could remake or ruin the fragile piece she'd built. He's not expecting an answer today, Davies continued. He just wanted you to know that he's thought of you every day. That if you're willing, when you're ready, he'd like to meet the boy. And, he hesitated. And see if what you both walked away from might still exist. I don't know if it can. Then read the letter. Take your time. I'm staying at the inn in the village. If you decide, I'll be there for another week. He tipped his cap and walked away, leaving Eliza standing in the doorway with a letter that felt like both promise and threat. She went back inside. Thomas had returned to his reading, already half forgotten the interruption. She sat by the fire and stared at the sealed paper, afraid to open it, afraid not to. Finally, as Thomas drifted towards sleep in his small bed in the corner, she broke the seal. The handwriting was immediately familiar, precise, controlled, but with a tremor that suggested the cost of writing it. Eliza, I don't know if this letter will find you. I don't know if, having found you, Davies will be welcomed or turned away. I don't know if you've built a life so complete that my intrusion would be cruelty rather than kindness. But I had to try. 7 years ago, you made an impossible choice. You took my son and disappeared to protect us all, from scandal, from suffering, from the impossible weight of a love that had no place in the world we inhabited. You were right to do so. I've spent 7 years understanding just how right you were. Beatrice is gone. I won't pretend at grief I don't feel. Our marriage was a performance that ended as it had existed, without warmth, without true loss. But her passing has freed me from obligations that bound me as surely as any chains. I am still the Duke. Still burdened by title and estate and the expectations of a society that forgives much in a man but demands adherence to its forms. But I am also, for the first time in my adult life, free to choose. And I choose you. If you'll have me. I choose Thomas, if is willing to know the father who made the terrible choice to let him go. I choose the life we might build, not in grand estates or through glittering society, but in whatever quiet corner of the world you found. I would give up the manor, the title, everything that binds me to the life I've known, if it meant waking beside you. If it meant watching my son grow up. If it meant, finally, being the man I glimpsed becoming in your cottage all those years ago. I don't expect immediate forgiveness. I don't expect easy reunion. 7 years is a gulf I may never fully cross. But if you're willing to try, if Thomas is willing to meet the father who loved him enough to lose him, then I am yours. Completely. Without reservation or escape. Tell him, if nothing else, that I have thought of him every day. That I have imagined his voice, his laugh, the man he might be becoming. That not a moment has passed when I didn't wonder if he was happy, safe, loved. Tell him that his father has always been a coward, but would very much like to learn courage from the woman who taught him what love truly means. Yours, if you'll still have me. Alistair. Eliza read it 3 times, tears streaming down her face in the firelight. She looked at Thomas, sleeping peacefully, unaware that the father he'd only known in stories might be within reach. Unaware that the life they'd built might be about to expand in ways both terrifying and wonderful. She thought of Alistair as she'd last seen him, standing at that window, shoulders rigid with grief, choosing duty because they'd given him no other choice. She thought of 7 years of loneliness. Of nights when she'd ached for conversation with someone who understood the impossible mathematics of their sacrifice. Of moments when Thomas did something clever or kind and she'd wished desperately that Alistair could see it. She thought of courage. Of the word Thomas had learned today, and what it truly meant. Being brave even when you're frightened. Even when doing the right thing costs you everything you hold dear. 7 years ago, courage had meant walking away. Perhaps now, courage meant walking back. Eliza stood, moved to her small writing desk, and began to compose a reply. Alistair, your letter found me. Found us. In a cottage by the sea where your son is learning to read and laugh and become someone extraordinary. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if we can build something real from the ruins of what we walked away from. I don't know if Thomas will welcome a father he's only known in stories, or if you can truly set aside the life you've known for the uncertainty of what we might become together. But I know this, I never stopped loving you. Even when loving you meant leaving. Even when it would have been easier to harden my heart than carry your memory like a candle through 7 years of darkness. And I know Thomas deserves to know his father. Not the Duke. Not the title. But the man who held him with trembling hands and looked at my cottage like it was sanctuary. Come to us. Not immediately, we both need time to prepare, to imagine what reconciliation might mean. But when the spring thaw comes and the roads are passable again, come north. Davies can show you the way. Come as a man, not a duke. Come ready to meet a boy who won't understand titles or estates but will measure you by whether you make his mother smile. Come prepared to start again, from the beginning, with no guarantees except that we will try. That's all I can offer. That's all any of us can offer. But perhaps, for people who've already learned that love means sacrifice, trying is enough. Yours, if you're brave enough to accept a life without grandeur. Eliza. P.S. His name is Thomas. He has your eyes. And when he laughs, I hear echoes of the man you were in my cottage, learning to hold hope without armor. She sealed the letter at dawn and walked through morning mist to the village, where Davies waited at the inn. "I'll see that he gets it," the coachman promised, his weathered face creasing with something like joy. "And Miss Moore? For what it's worth, I think you're both very brave." Eliza walked back to the cottage as the sun broke through clouds, painting everything gold. Inside, Thomas was waking, stretching like a small cat, blinking sleep from his eyes. "Mama." His voice was muzzy with dreams. "What's that smile for?" "I'm just happy," she said, gathering him into her arms. "Very, very happy." "Why?" "Because sometimes," she said softly, "the things we think we've lost forever find their way back to us. Not the same as they were, but something new. Something better for having been tested." Thomas didn't understand, not fully. But he smiled back anyway, trusting her the way he always had, the way children trust when they've never been given reason to doubt. And Eliza held her son and watched the morning light fill their small cottage and allowed herself, for the first time in 7 years, to hope. Spring would come. Roads would clear. And a man who'd learned that love meant letting go would arrive to discover if it could also mean holding on. Not perfectly. Not without difficulty or the weight of years lost. But honestly. Hopefully. Together. The sea continued its endless rhythm against the shore. And in a cottage where a woman and a boy had built a life from sacrifice and survival, love, quiet and patient and tested beyond measure, prepared to bloom again. Some loves are never spoken of. Others are remembered. If you have listened to the end, then this secret did not vanish as it was meant to. You may leave now, as history quietly expected you to. Or you may remain, by subscribing, and remember the lives that were asked to carry the truth so that others would not have to. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it?